Good evening, welcome to the show. I'm Shari Maxson. Here's what's coming up. Israel storms the Gaza hospital Hamas is using as its command post. Former Israeli Ambassador Dave Sharma will join me to discuss the very latest on the war. Peter Dutton urges Anthony Albanese to cancel his overseas trip and convene a national cabinet meeting on the twin crises of anti-Semitism on the streets and the criminals released from detention. The opposition leader's powerful speech coming up. And former UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman accuses Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of betraying the country as new Foreign Secretary David Cameron makes big waves on his first day back in Parliament in years. But first to the immigration scandal and the 83 hardcore criminals now free on our streets. The government promised these criminals would be under strict supervision, but that doesn't appear to be happening. 1/3 of the criminals were released to a motel in WA on the weekend. A journalist from the West Australian spent the night at this motel and reported a serious absence of supervision with no conditions placed on them. He wrote this: the federal government repeatedly said the Australian Border Force and WA Police were managing the 32 unlawful non-citizens released into Perth after the High Court ruled last Wednesday their indefinite detention was unlawful. However, the Australian Border Force and WA Police were nowhere to be seen on Monday and Tuesday as the group were left to freely explore Thornley, a Perth suburb notorious for its crime. The journalist described scenes of chaos, with one inmate boasting about drug use. There was talk of buying alcohol before they piled into cars and drove around Perth. Peter Dutton today described this as a taxpayer-funded holiday.
You see in WA, in Perth, you've got these people having a holiday in a motel at taxpayers' expense. And the Minister yesterday misled the Parliament when he says that there are rigorous conditions imposed on these people. How are they being enforced?
How are they being enforced? Well, that's a good question. The ABC reported today that some of the detainees released from immigration detention were sent into the community without visas. This means that they would have been under no restrictions at all and no monitoring either. The ABC reported that at least a dozen people left immigration detention on the weekend as unlawful non-citizens, and they only had their bridging visas confirmed on Monday and Tuesday. The government at first denied this in question time today, but then sidestepped the issue of when exactly the bridging visas were granted.
The ABC has just reported that following the High Court decision, the government released some of the 80 hardened criminals, which include murderers, rapists and child sex offenders, into the community without a visa. Is this true?
I say again, complying with the orders of the High Court is not optional. It is incumbent on this government and on any government. All those who have been required by the decision of the court to be released have been placed on appropriate visas with appropriate conditions, and as I've outlined at some length in the chamber, there has been quite an extensive process of engagement with relevant law enforcement authorities.
Well, as you heard, the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles clearly didn't answer the question there. But for those who have been released with a bridging visa, the only consequence for violating their visa conditions would be to detain them pending removal. But as you know, the High Court has ruled out detention as an option. It said ongoing detention indefinitely is unlawful. So it appears the visa conditions may be unenforceable. As James Paterson pointed out in the Senate today, it seems there are no workable restrictions or conditions potentially on any of these 83 criminals who've now been released. Paterson describes this as an elaborate ruse. Now, this whole scandal emerged after the High Court last week ruled indefinite detention was illegal and unconstitutional. The government, apparently unprepared for the ruling, had no plan to keep the public safe from murderers, rapists and sex pests, now free after this High Court decision. Immigration Minister Andrew Giles spoke about just how dangerous some of these asylum seekers are who are now on the streets.
The decision of the High Court, which required release, affects some very, very serious offenders, including people who have committed the offences you've described. Sex offenders, a murderer, at least one murderer. I believe there are 3 murderers. There are several sex offenders.
The opposition has been in uproar, claiming the government is out of its depth on national security and that it was their responsibility to prepare for this outcome of the High Court.
We've now got a government who is asleep at the wheel and has allowed 81 hardcore criminals out into the community at a time when there is already, in many parts of the country, very significant law and order issues where victims, as we see on the news every night, are suffering because the justice system is failing them. We're not talking about people here who have been low-level offenders. We're talking about murderers and rapists and pedophiles and people who pose a threat to our national security. What higher order priority could the Prime Minister have than dealing with this issue?
And Dutton has now demanded emergency legislation to keep the public safe from these criminals. And Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan says Parliament should not rise until the issue is resolved. But the government appears to be at odds over whether or not legislation is the answer to this. On rival breakfast television programs today, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill said no legislation can get around the High Court decision, but then Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles said that legislation was being examined.
The idea that it is open to the Australian government to simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works.
In terms of looking at legislative options going forward, we are examining all of that in the face of this decision.
A clear contradiction there. And the government is under immense public pressure now over this scandal, and it does appear that they'll have to rush through legislation this week. There's public outrage that the 83 criminals are receiving welfare and taxpayer-funded accommodation. And there's concern for community safety, with Dutton suggesting that communities should be warned if the criminals are going to be living among them, because many, he says, are repeat offenders. And he argues some of the criminals should be deported even if their country of origin has the death penalty. He says there's precedent for this.
I'm not going into individual cases, but there are plenty of negotiations that can take place for a person to be returned and assurances given about the death penalty or about penalties otherwise. That has happened in a number of cases over a long period of time. So what is the consequence of the Prime Minister failing? Well, sadly, there will be more victims of these criminals because these are repeat offenders. These are people that haven't just raped or molested one individual. And if we need to advise communities to keep them safe, that's what should happen.
This immigration scandal has further exposed the Albanese government as weak on national security. And it's also contributed to a sense of a government in chaos, lacking in leadership and unable to get a handle on major, foreseeable and preventable scandals. The reality is this. It's 18 months since Albanese swept to office. Over the past few months, the government he leads has proven to be reactive to events, its priorities are confused, it has the wrong instincts, and it's not in tune with public sentiment. Just have a think about the failures and ineptitude over the past few months. The Voice campaign and then the referendum defeat. The misinformation legislation that would be better suited to a communist dictatorship, yet the government stubbornly persists with it, despite the backlash from both the left and the right. Then there's Albanese's weak response to the rise in anti-Semitism as a result of petty politics and votes in Western Sydney. His failure to unequivocally stand up and address the rise in this ancient hatred to stop the danger on our streets further endangers our Jewish community. His decision to visit our enemy in China, but not our friend in Israel. Then there's the radical industrial relation laws that have seen every employer group and business body join together in protest. There's inflation and the cost of living crisis that's seeing more Australian families go hungry than at any other time this century. And don't forget the COVID inquiry that excludes the states, letting them off the hook, meaning there'll be no lessons learned of health measures for the next pandemic. And of course, the Qantas scandal, where a commercial advantage was given to the national airline, even though it meant pushing up airfares for Australians. The worst breakdown in social cohesion and racism we've seen in years is now arising on our streets. It's happening under Anthony Albanese's watch, and he's doing nothing about it. This is unfolding at the same time as a painful cost of living crisis that's crippling hundreds of thousands of families. Does this government realise it needs to govern for all Australians, not just Green left voters in Labor seats? It can't abandon Jewish Australians, and it can't abandon vulnerable battlers. Yet Albanese is spending most of his time overseas at the moment. He's heading off on his 20th overseas trip this week. And when he's overseas, he refuses to take questions on what he calls domestic issues. But this is his way of avoiding having to comment on the mounting crises that are happening under his prime ministership. We have to ask, who is actually leading the country and who is in charge of our national security? Sky News host and Sunday Herald Sun columnist Steve Price joins me now. Steve, what did you make of Peter Dutton's quite extraordinary speech in question time today? I'm going to come back to it and play it on the show a bit later because it really was sensational in the way that he stood up for the Jewish community, really strong comments. What did you think of it?
Yeah, I think he was very powerful. I think Peter Dutton has really risen in this whole issue over both the Jewish situation in Australia, the anti-Semitism that's on the rise, Shari, that you've covered so brilliantly, and he's also risen on this issue of these 83 people who have been released into the community. I mean, I think there's always been some question marks over Peter Dutton. I think what he's shown, particularly today, and I'm pleased you're going to play that speech at length, I think what Peter Dutton has shown that he is showing real leadership. And what it's showing is that compared to Anthony Albanese, he's not walking away from the hard decisions. He's prepared to lead and he's prepared to make unpopular decisions if need be. And I think Peter Dutton's chances of becoming the next Prime Minister are growing by the day.
Now, one Labor politician who is showing leadership on anti-Semitism is the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns. And today he blasted a Western Sydney-based business that refused to hire out a jumping castle to Masada School. It's a Jewish school in Sydney. And this company then bragged about it on social media, calling it outrageous. The owner of the Western Sydney company, and I'm not going to give them publicity by saying their name, well, Tanya Isa took to Instagram saying that she was refusing this request from Masada College. She said, "There's no way I'm taking a Zionist booking. I don't want your blood money. Free Palestine." Steve, what do you think of this?
Well, the only reason I'd use their name, and because you don't want to, I won't, is to send them broke. I mean, this is just an outrageous decision by this company. Jumping castles are for kids to have fun on. And, you know, this company has just made an absolute mess of what they've said on that social media post. And I would urge anyone who does know the name of it not to use their services in the future. And I can't believe that this decision by her to do that hasn't broken some anti-discrimination laws or race hate laws in the state of New South Wales. And you're right, Chris Minns, the Premier of New South Wales, has been stronger than any of his other Labor colleagues as premiers right around the country.
Well, that brings us to your Premier in Victoria, Steve, Jacinta Allen. And meanwhile, she's defending a pro-Palestine school strike. I mean, honestly, defending kids going out of school to protest against Israel, it's disgusting. This is planned for next Thursday, and the Premier said it's a fundamental principle of our democracy that must not and should not change. This is an absolute failure of leadership, Steve.
Is it ever? And look, Jacinta Allen is of the socialist left. She spent her entire student political career and now her political career as a pro-Palestine politician and activist. And this is her worst nightmare because she's supposed to be the Premier of the whole state and look after all Victorians, and clearly she's not. And to say that kids could just walk out of school and gather on the steps of Flinders Street, all you're doing is taking the division between the Jewish population of Melbourne, students, and non-Jewish students, and putting it into the classroom and causing more disruption. It is absolutely outrageous that she would support that. I hope she changes her mind, and I hope parents who are watching and listening say to their kids, don't get involved.
Exactly. And we know how aggressive and anti-Semitic those protests are, and now we're just exposing a young generation to that. It's really quite awful. Meanwhile, the former Premier Daniel Andrews has been blocked from joining an elite golf club that I believe you might be a member of, Steve, the Portsea Golf Club on the Mornington Peninsula. Give us the inside scoop. What's going on here?
Well, there's been a development this afternoon. The president of my club, the Portsea Golf Club, has said that there won't be any new members put up until the second quarter of next year. But if Dan Andrews is nominated, he'll let the process run as the constitution of the club says it should. But I can give the president a message tonight. Most of the members of his golf club would not want Dan Andrews as a member. If Dan Andrews is allowed to join the Portsea Golf Club, I'll quit, I'll resign, I'll tear up my membership, and I'll go and play golf somewhere else.
Why? Why can't you play golf alongside the former Premier?
This is the Premier who stopped us playing golf for 2 years during COVID. This is the Premier who locked down this community even though we're 120 kilometres out of the city. Same Premier who let people on the other side of the bay play golf. No way should that man come into the golf club. And I tell you what, golf clubs are places where people like to get on with each other. And I know that the majority of members at that golf club that I know, I'm not saying all of them, but the ones that I know, would be very uncomfortable having him there. I hope he does not get into our club.
I'm so surprised at that. I mean, I thought we could all have different opinions, but that you can still kind of wave at someone. I've never played golf myself, so maybe it's not just a matter of waving from across a golf course, but I'll take your word for it. Steve Price, thank you so much for your time. Now, the Prime Minister is urging Australians to understand that the budget surplus is more important than providing cost of living relief. This is more and more Australian families are struggling with the rising cost of living and struggling to put food on the table. Albanese says that spending the surplus dollars would only make inflation worse. Well, joining me now is Deputy Editor of the Australian Financial Review, Kyla Lasukian. Great to see you, Kyla. Look, wages have jumped by their highest rate in history in the September quarter. This is the strongest quarterly wage growth since the ABS began recording data 26 years ago. We're also seeing, though, high inflation, a cost of living crisis. What's your view of the economic picture that we're looking at for Australia? And are we looking at entrenched inflation now?
Well, I think the good news is that, if there is that much good news, that the market seems to think there's not really going to be another rate rise, next month. So, I guess that's good for homeowners. Next year, though, the market seems pretty split. So there's a 50% chance, they say, that interest rates will keep going up. And I guess that's the difficult position the government finds itself in. Growth is ticking along, people are coming into the country, demand is kind of growing. But at the same time, those things that we need, obviously, skilled migration, all those types of things, they're the kinds of things that are also going to be driving up inflation. So I think the RBA said last week they were a bit more pessimistic about inflation coming down kind of in the near term. So I think we're probably stuck with it for a bit longer.
Yeah, high immigration is said to be one of the biggest factors, and we've spoken about it on the show, driving the increased inflation and also, of course, putting pressure on the rental crisis and housing supply. It seems like at the moment it's really up to the RBA to tackle interest, to raise rates, to tackle inflation. Should the government be doing more, and what can it do?
Well, that's the tricky thing. I don't know. I think probably personally the best outcome is that they don't do anything. More spending by the government. I know there's obviously, they might want to go and spend some money trying to alleviate the cost of living pressures that you've mentioned. That's a pretty easy enough thing to do. But I think doing that exact thing is what's actually going to be contributing to inflation. So it's a bit of a kind of a chicken and egg situation, unfortunately. I mean, there's a few things that can be done in the longer term, although that's not really going to help right now. One of the things that we've seen the Financial Review's been covering is this issue about infrastructure. So the RBA, and other people reckon that, we're spending quite a lot on infrastructure, and a lot of that is pushing up, the cost of construction, the cost of labour, materials, all that kind of thing. So the government wants to bring that back a little bit. I mean, they can do that. They say they're doing that, but that's not going to have an immediate reaction. So it's very hard for them to do very much except for making it worse. So hopefully they don't do very much at all.
All right, I want to turn to this incredible story in your paper today, which is why I wanted to speak with you tonight. Leaked emails reveal that PwC helped a Russian oligarch escape sanctions at the outbreak of the Ukraine war. And according to this report, PwC helped them hide their billions in Cyprus bank accounts. Kyla, how did they do this, and how serious is this new allegation for PwC?
Yeah, it's an incredible story, isn't it? Written by my colleague Neil Chenoweth. And so, I mean, the gist is that Cyprus seems to be a pretty, popular destination for wealthy Russians, to put their money through, to have their companies in. PwC there seems to have, back in 2001, they started a little company called, I think it was called Sipco Direct or something like that. It was like an offshoot of PwC Cyprus. It had a lot of the same people. They shared apparently health benefits and all sorts of things. So I guess there's questions about how separate a company it really is. Anyway, between them and PwC Cyprus, according to these leaked documents, there was a lot of frantic movement of assets, all sorts of things like that. Look, they might not 100% be in breach of sanctions, but they're certainly very close to the line if they're not. And that's kind of that's what Neil has been reporting on. It's quite a fascinating story.
Has there been any response from them today?
Well, the government in Cyprus say that they are that they're investigating at least one of the matters. There was one that sailed very close to the line, which was a transfer of a whole bunch of assets that was owned by one very wealthy Russian oligarch who I think was fairly close to Vladimir Putin, certainly was in a meeting with him kind of on the day or days around the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So they're looking into that because that one was quite amazing. The assets were transferred into his wife's name with no price. It was just kind of like, we'll just move it and then we'll sort the details out later. We've got to get it done quickly because the EU is going to be announcing sanctions, very shortly. So that's what the government in Cyprus says. The PwC have kind of hedged their bets a little bit. They don't think that they've done anything wrong, but I guess this will only play out. Really, it's a very interesting picture because we've been reporting about what PwC is doing here, what's happened with PwC here. So it looks like it's not just an Australian issue, kind of skirting close to the close to the law, close to regulations, but it is something that is affecting the company all around the world.
All right, Kyla Sukian, thank you very much for your time. And Kyla's Deputy Editor at the Fin Review. Now coming up, Israel storms the Gaza hospital where Hamas has been basing itself and hiding weapons. New information also revealing that Hamas planned its October 7 attacks to be even more deadly than they were. Dave Sharma will join me next. Welcome back. Well, can it get more cowardly than terrorists using the sick and injured, the most vulnerable as human shields, to try and protect themselves from attack? Well, that's what Hamas has been doing. And their whole network of tunnels also runs next to schools with weapons stored in classrooms. And it's why just hours ago, Israeli troops stormed Gaza's main hospital, Al-Shifa, in an operation the IDF says is essential to defeat the terrorists who are running their military operations from inside its walls. And this comes after Israel seized key Hamas government buildings yesterday, including its parliament. The IDF said it is now carrying out a precise and targeted operation in a specific area of the Shifa hospital. They say it's an operational necessity and have called on Hamas to surrender. The IDF said that their forces include medical teams and Arabic speakers who've undergone specified training to prepare for this complex and sensitive environment. They say the intent is that no harm will be caused to the civilians being used by Hamas as human shields. And the Jerusalem Post reports that the IDF has found a specially equipped room 30 metres underground where two Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Daif, might have been in hiding. The room is at the bottom of a tunnel that's been captured by the IDF. Now, the White House has also come out to say that it has its own intelligence to show that Hamas has, in fact, been using the Shifa hospital as a command centre. US National Security spokesman John Kirby told reporters on Air Force One that Hamas was storing weapons in tunnels and underneath the hospital.
I can confirm for you that we have information that Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad use some hospitals in the Gaza Strip, including Al-Shifa, and tunnels underneath them to conceal and to support their military operations and to hold hostages. Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, members operate a command and control node from Al-Shifa in Gaza City. They have stored weapons there, and they're prepared to respond to an Israeli military operation against that facility.
But with all the anger and the aggression of the pro-Palestinian protests we've seen lately, it was heartwarming to see this incredible sight today. Nearly 300,000 Israeli supporters marching in Washington. They demanded, "Let our people go," a reference to both the 230 hostages, including a 10-month-old baby, held in a terrorist dungeon, but also, of course, a reference to the demands of Jewish slaves centuries ago against Pharaoh in Egypt. New US Speaker of the House Mike Johnson told the crowd that calls for a ceasefire were outrageous.
This is a fight between good and evil, between light and darkness, between civilization and barbarism. The calls for a ceasefire are outrageous.
And Israeli President Isaac Herzog addressed the rally by video link. He said, "Never again is now." He said the march was for the babies, the boys, the girls, women and men who are being held hostage, but also for the right of every Jew to live proudly and safely around the world. Now, as you know, it has felt like a lonely past month and a half for the Jewish community. And each night on this program, I implore the Prime Minister to show leadership on this epidemic of anti-Semitism that we're seeing. Each day he doesn't, and the crisis gets worse and worse. The Prime Minister has a particular responsibility to set the tone of what's acceptable in this country. And former Prime Ministers would have shown leadership. They would have come out strongly and taken charge of this unacceptable and despicable explosion in anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Australia, in the hearts of our major cities. You wonder if the Prime Minister ever listens to the pleas from our community. Well, today, he was forced to sit there in Parliament and listen, as Opposition Leader Peter Dutton gave an extraordinary speech, one of the most powerful of his career, where he demanded the Prime Minister cancel his overseas trip to deal with this crisis of anti-Semitism. He accused Albanese and Penny Wong of speaking out of both sides of their mouth and of failing to protect our Jewish community.
Caucus is split right down the middle, and the Australian public sees that this is a government where the wheels are quickly falling off. And this Prime Minister is flying off overseas again when he should be staying in this country to deal with the issue. I never thought that I would see in my lifetime a repeat of the horrific scenes that we saw and that we've read about during the course of the Second World War repeated in our lifetimes, but to see people of Jewish faith cowering in their homes, being dragged from cupboards out into the street, when children are still abducted and still held hostage, this Prime Minister needs to stand up and to be united with the Jewish community, and he's not.
All right, Australia's former ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, joins me now. Dave, thank you so much for your time. What did you make of that amazing speech by Peter Dutton today and the people it was directed at, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong?
Well, I'm glad Peter Dutton has called this out, Sherry. I've been saying this for some time now, that our political leaders, and they are at the state and federal Labor leaders, have been insufficiently clear in condemning what has been happening in Australia, which has been outrageous and intolerable. And they haven't been crystal clear in their condemnation of that, and they haven't been crystal clear in their instructions to law enforcement authorities to clamp down on this. And now, as a result, as the way this has been allowed to run, starting, of course, with the Opera House protest, that disgrace to Australia. Starting with that, we've now got a community here who I know personally. I'm not Jewish myself, but I know them personally. They are living in fear. They feel menaced. They feel intimidated. Many of them feel terrified. Many of them feel unsafe. How have we let this happen? Well, the reason we have is because our political leaders here have failed us, and Peter Dutton is right to call that out.
You wrote a piece in the Weekend Australian, first published on Friday afternoon, where you were critical of Penny Wong. You say she's been missing in action on the Middle East. What are your main criticisms of her and the role she's played?
Well, they're twofold. Firstly, her, but also others in the government, have been, as Peter Dutton said, speaking out of both sides of their mouths. They're condemning anti-Semitism, but then they're also condemning Islamophobia. Now, I've only seen evidence of anti-Semitism in Australia. I haven't seen any evidence of Islamophobia. If I see it, I'll certainly condemn it as well. But they've been engaged in this sort of, both sides are at fault type of moral equivalence, which has no place given what the Jewish community is enduring right now. But secondly, she seems to think that her role is to just be some sort of armchair commentator and critic, always putting Israel in the dock, arguing that Israel shouldn't be doing this, shouldn't be doing that, often without any evidence, accusing Israel of something that's pretty close to war crimes, which is a very serious charge to be laying. And certainly as the foreign minister, you need to be careful in the sort of words you use. Now, if Penny Wong cares so much about civilian life and the loss of civilian life, then I'd urge her to get involved and do what every foreign minister of nearly every other significant country, often their leaders, has done, and go and visit the region, register your messages directly, speak to the Palestinian Authority, speak to Israel's ministers, register what you want to convey. But instead, she's an armchair critic sitting in Adelaide, giving press conferences and scoring Israel's performance. I just don't think it's the way an Australian foreign minister is meant to behave. Yeah, continually lecturing Israel. Now, Dave, what I loved about your piece in the Weekend Australian is that it offered hope. And sometimes it feels like there isn't much hope at the moment. But you write that Hamas's defeat, and surely there will be a defeat, that this defeat could set the stage for a broader peace effort and a final resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Take me through your thinking here. Well, I think it's important to understand, Sherry, that Hamas has been an obstacle to peace since it was created nearly 30 years ago. Hamas-aligned people were behind the first Intifada, which derailed the Oslo process. They were involved in the second Intifada after the Camp David summit. Even when I was in Israel in 2014, the last major peace effort in the second term of the Obama administration, negotiations were happening between the Palestinian Authority and Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. Progress was being made. That all came to a grinding halt when Hamas kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli teenagers and started a war against Israel. And I think you're seeing a pattern here. Hamas just started this conflict almost certainly to disrupt an Israeli-Saudi peace effort that was underway. So if you believe in peace and if you believe in a better future, not only for the Israeli people, but also for the Palestinian people, then Hamas has to be vacated from the scene. And the quicker that Hamas can be defeated militarily and removed from political power, the quicker we can have the Palestinians governed by an entity that at least recognises Israel's right to exist, at least is not committed to the extermination of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. There is a prospect then for negotiations and talks. And Hamas has been an obstacle to this now since its creation, since it was first set up. And the quicker they go from the scene, the better the future can be for Israelis and Palestinians. Yeah. All right, Dave Sharma, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Now, coming up, the opposition is accusing the government of being asleep at the wheel over the High Court immigration debacle. Bridget McKenzie and Andrew Charlton will debate this topic next. If
you're just tuning in, here are tonight's top stories. The Israeli military is carrying out an operation inside Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital as US intelligence reveals Hamas is using the civilian hospital as a command centre. Tens of thousands of Israel supporters marched on Washington's National Mall in protest to rising anti-Semitism and to demand the return of hostages. Optus confirmed an upgrade from their parent company caused the nationwide meltdown this week as the company faces the possibility of a class action from angry customers. Chinese President Xi Jinping landed in San Francisco on his first US trip in 6 years as he prepares for a high-stakes meeting with Joe Biden. And King Charles celebrated his 75th birthday with the launch of a food drive campaign and a small family event. Well, opposition leader Peter Dutton says Labor should have anticipated the High Court decision that ultimately saw the release of 83 criminals back in the community. He's demanding the Prime Minister cancel his overseas trip, but the Prime Minister is already on his way to San Francisco, dashing to the airport as soon as question time finished. Joining me now, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and Labor MP for Parramatta, Andrew Charlton. Welcome to you both. Andrew, doesn't the opposition have a point here that the government should have anticipated this High Court ruling and had legislation or other measures ready to go to protect the community from these criminals now on the streets?
Well, good to be with you, Shari. First, let me say that the crimes committed by these people are disgusting and abhorrent. The answer to your question is we didn't know the High Court's reasonings for their decision until they gave their judgment. And we have to consider those reasons as we develop the legal framework to ensure that we create a new legal framework that is constitutional and doesn't get struck down again. Remember, this is the legal framework that was being operated by the previous government. It was judged to be unconstitutional by the High Court. And now we're doing the work to update that framework based on the High Court's decision so that we can maintain community safety and have legislation that is consistent with the Constitution.
Bridget, is the coalition, the former government, partly to blame here, as Andrew just indicated?
Well, I think Labor has once again been caught flat-footed without a plan. We've got 83 people released into the community. We don't know where they are, and we are subjecting them each and every day in both the Senate and the House of Representatives to legitimate questions about how can the government guarantee safety and what are they going to do about the rapists, murderers and pedophiles that are now on the loose in our community. And we've been told that they are governed by strict visa conditions, which is actually not the case. And the minister responsible is refusing to answer questions of Peter Dutton and Dan Tehan in the House of Representatives again today. The reality is these sort of matters go before the High Court across a whole raft of portfolio when you're in government and you have an army of King's Counsel in your department that you can actually seek advice from. If it goes this way, what might be a piece of draft legislation, what might be some of the things we need to consider so that you can avail yourself of a range of options in a swift fashion once the High Court makes its decision. To have not done anything, any preparation, when this actually judgment was handed down just shows the level of incompetence of the Albanese government.
Andrew,
well, can I say?
Yeah, of course you can.
It's
Jump
completely
in.
wrong. It's completely wrong to suggest that the government did no preparation. The minister.
Well, why can't your minister answer basic questions when asked in question time?
The minister has been answering all of the questions provided to him, and he has stated that the government prepared for this in a number of ways, and that has meant that we've been able to put these people into the most secure visa classes possible, monitor them on an individual basis in cooperation with state authorities, and put community safety first and foremost in our response.
They're actually not all on visas, Andrew. That's the whole point. They are the questions that are actually being asked.
That is also untrue. All of these people
Giles
are on visas.
has been refusing to answer.
What you're saying is just not true. All of these people are on visas. Some of them are on the strictest possible visas, and we're working to update the legislative framework that you operated, which the High Court has just struck down.
Well, the ABC did report today Andrew and Bridget, that when a group of them, the ABC is reporting that about a dozen, when they were first released, they were declared unlawful citizens, so that they weren't on any bridging visas, but it looks like they are now all on bridging visas. Andrew Giles kind of sidestepped that question. I played his comments earlier in my show tonight. He didn't answer, succinctly in question time when he was asked by Dan Tehan whether or not that ABC report was accurate. But we've also seen that report again that I spoke about earlier in the show from the WA, the West Australian newspaper, that a group of 23 of these criminals were at a motel and there was no supervision. So, it doesn't look like they all are being supervised, or at least they weren't. Hopefully they will be now. But Andrew, if you're not across this, please just say so, because I know you're not the relevant minister, but does it look like there will be legislation introduced this week to address this issue that's so concerning the community?
Look, the government has said, Shari, that we are working on legislation to update the legislative framework that was operated by the previous government, which has been struck down by the High Court. Now that we have the reasons for the High Court's decision, we are working to update that legislation, and the government has made it clear that that legislation will be forthcoming, and we look forward to the opposition's support to update that framework in a way that maintains community safety, corrects the unconstitutionality that was embedded in the framework that they operated and has been exposed by the High Court.
Shari, what Andrew isn't giving us any confidence is that the government has a plan to get this done quickly. The government's lawyers and legal advisors need to be working around the clock to put legislation into Parliament this week. We don't come back for another week and a half. And that's a week and a half that 83 people with criminal records, horrendous crimes have been committed, as Andrew says, by these people, are loose in our community with little or no supervision if the reports are to be believed. We are prepared to stay here for as long as it takes to get this legislation done. Now, the Prime Minister might think it's okay to take off overseas. The Senate's staying till Friday afternoon. I'm sure the House of Reps would be happy to stay back in the interests of community safety to get this done.
All right, let's move on to another topic, the topic of inflation. I'm sure that's a favourite topic for you, Andrew. The Prime Minister is telling Australian families that the budget surplus is more important than providing cost of living relief. While cost of living relief would undoubtedly, or presumably, make the inflation crisis worse, isn't that a very difficult message to be telling Australians who are struggling to put food on the table, and particularly when Albanese promised them before the last federal election that life would be more affordable under his government?
Look, Shari, we've been getting a lot of very confused messages from the opposition on the budget surplus. The truth is the opposition hates Labor's budget surplus, and the reason they hate it is because they couldn't deliver it in the 9 years that they were in office. In answer to your question, the budget surplus is helping Australians struggling with the cost of living. The budget surplus is taking pressure off inflation. The budget surplus is taking pressure off the RBA, which is taking pressure off interest rates. So that budget surplus is not an either-or between the budget surplus and cost of living. That budget surplus is helping the cost of living of every Australian struggling with a mortgage. It's helping the cost of living of every Australian trying to make ends meet and pay their bills. On top of that, the government is providing targeted relief in areas like energy, like childcare, and the largest increase in Commonwealth rent assistance ever. So it's not an either-or between the budget and the cost of living. The budget is a central element of our plan to support the cost of living, bring down inflation, and ease interest rates.
And yet, Shari, the OECD has reported Australians have the largest fall in living standards in a year in the OECD. Australians are not feeling this, and critical economists like Mr Richardson have been saying it is cutting government spending that will actually assist in the inflation task.
But that creates, a bigger budget surplus.
This government is... I gave you a fair go, Andrew. This government is not doing anything to rein in its actual spending, and the budget figures actually show that. Inflation is higher than they anticipated. for longer than they anticipated in their budget, and that's hurting every single Australian family right now.
Bridget can't decide whether she wants
I thought we were going for quick
surplus or a
answers.
shorter or a smaller budget surplus. Which one do you want?
I'm just saying what the economists are saying, Andrew, not just what you're saying. Mr Richardson was very, very clear that it is about cutting government spending, and your government is simply increasing spending across the board.
All right, we're out of
So you
time,
want less
both of you.
assistance.
Andrew Charlton,
Thanks,
Bridget
Shari.
McKenzie, thank you both so much for joining me, as always, on a Wednesday. Now, after the break, The Spectator's James Heal will break down the drama that's unfolding at number 10 Downing Street and whether it'll affect Australia. Stay tuned. Well, former Home Secretary of the UK, Suella Braverman, has launched a brutal attack against Rishi Sunak, telling him in a letter he's betrayed the nation by failing to stop the boats. Her sacking on Monday prompted a major cabinet reshuffle. It saw the extraordinary return of former Prime Minister David Cameron not only to Parliament but as Foreign Secretary. Political correspondent for The Spectator, James Heal, joins me now. Thank you so much for your time. Look, the return of David Cameron is completely stunning, but then so is the sacking of Suella Braverman, because in my view, from what I could see from Australia, she's been doing an unbelievable job, and she was right to call out police for their poor handling of the pro-Palestinian protests. What do you think?
Yeah, well, there's two real elements here. One is the shock return of David Cameron, a reaction that I think has divided the Conservative Party in Britain. Those MPs which are in more upmarket, wealthier seats in the south of England have been texting me, telling me that they're delighted with the appointment, that it sends a good signal to a lot of voters who felt, put off since 2015, 2016, when David Cameron stepped down to win those back. But there's other MPs who are in those kind of more Brexit-supporting northern seats in the country, typically less well off, who are saying, actually, this is terrible. This is the man who lost us the referendum, and now he's going to be in charge of our post-Brexit global policy. Combined with that, as you say, there's Suella Braverman's departure after a whole year of series of different incidents, lots of fighting with the Prime Minister, and she has written an incendiary resignation letter, departure letter, criticising his leadership, 3 pages, one of the most unprecedented I can remember in recent history, and all this comes on the same day as the UK government is expecting a major decision in the Supreme Court verdict over its Rwanda offshoring policy. So it's going to be a big week in Westminster, and there's a lot of questions about Rishi Sunak's future leadership of the party.
Look, on his first day as Foreign Secretary, David Cameron has announced sanctions against Hamas leaders. These are strong laws, though. I mean, it is a good policy that he's announced, first thing in the job.
Well, quite. And I think that, David Cameron has always been a staunch ally of Israel. We showed that when he was Prime Minister for 6 years. And I think that this was really, first of all, a demonstration of how, as Foreign Secretary, you have to do things from day one. But second of all, the importance of targeting Hamas's leaders and financiers who are operating outside of Gaza, pulling the strings from outside of Gaza. So targeted sanctions, working with Britain's American allies under American leadership. And I think that shows a different way of targeting Hamas's leadership, because, of course, they're not in the way of these bombs that are falling and what's happening and going on in Israel and Gaza. So it's one good sign, but I'm sure there'll be more sanctions to follow.
Right, James Heal, thank you so much for joining us to update us on that quite dramatic turn of events in London. Thank you so much for watching tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And here is Peter Credlin.